First up, Israel is seeking to mend its strained ties with the United States after it cancelled a high-level delegation meeting on the Rafah crisis. It had asked the White House to reschedule the meeting on military plans for Gaza's Rafah city after the U.S. allowed the passage of the Gaza ceasefire resolution. Netanyahu angrily called off a planned visit to Washington by a senior Israeli delegation. The suspension left America perplexed as it tried to get Netanyahu to consider alternatives to a ground invasion of Rafah amid a growing humanitarian crisis.
So I can confirm that talks continue, and the United States is actively engaged in those conversations. We remain hopeful that we can broker a deal to secure the release of hostages and establish a temporary ceasefire.
The change in Netanyahu's stand comes after he criticized the U.S. abstaining from the UNSC resolution and stated that Hamas should understand that international pressure on Israel won't work. The talks are now expected to focus on Israel's threatened offensive in Rafah after Ramadan. Earlier this week, Israeli Defense Minister had held several discussions with senior U.S. officials as threat of the Rafah operations have increased differences between the U.S. and Israel. While meeting his Israeli counterpart, the U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin had also said the civilian casualties in Gaza were way too high. It also raises questions whether the U.S. is going to restrict military aid to Israel if Netanyahu decides to move ahead with the Rafah invasion.
In Gaza today, the number of civilian casualties is far too high.
And we earlier spoke to our correspondent Jody Cohen to tell us more about the cancellation of the Israeli delegation visit to the U.S., which now appears to be back on track. This is what she had to tell us.
Right, so Prime Minister Netanyahu cancelled the Israeli delegation that was going to Washington. That was after the US abstained from and didn't use their veto against the UN Security Council resolution that called for a ceasefire during Ramadan. Now, Israel opposed the resolution because it didn't tie in the ceasefire to the release of Israeli hostages who've been held in Gaza for 6 months. Now, Netanyahu said that he cancelled the delegation to send a message to Hamas that Israel would not bow to international pressure on the war in Gaza. Commentators also believe that cancelling the delegation was to send a message to the US. And Netanyahu called the US decision very bad and said that the resolution encouraged Hamas to take a hard line on the hostage release talks. Now, according to a US official, Israel and the US are looking to reschedule the Israeli delegation going to Washington, and the two administrations are reportedly looking for a new date for that meeting.
And we also asked Jody, what are the talks between the US and Israel, and what are they likely to mean for the planned Israeli offensive in Gaza?
So Israeli experts have said that the most effective way to target Hamas in Rafah is to evacuate civilians and through a ground operation. They've suggested that that would enable Israel also to look for information on the hostages and to destroy key Hamas smuggling tunnels. Now, White House spokesperson John Kirby has suggested that the Biden administration supports targeting Hamas in Rafah, recognizes that Hamas still poses a threat to Israel, but wants to discuss other ways to target Hamas and not through a ground operation. Kirby said that in Defense Secretary Austin's meeting with Israeli Defense Minister Gallant this week, that Austin said that the US can't support a major ground offensive in Rafah that doesn't include an achievable plan to look after the civilians there. Now, according to a report, the Israeli plan would involve evacuating the civilians to central Gaza via protected routes. And Israel's reportedly preparing for a Rafah operation after Ramadan in late April or early May if the hostage release talks remain stalled.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.